In the deep south of the United States, in the year 1839, a story unfolded that few dared to speak of aloud. A story so brutal that it was buried in silence for generations. On a quiet piece of land in Alabama, surrounded by cotton fields that stretched endlessly beneath the burning sun, stood a cabin where enslaved men and women endured unspeakable torment. They were seen as property, denied their names, their families, their humanity. Yet in that same cabin, a secret was born, one that would change everything. On the night of the harvest festival, while music, laughter, and celebration filled the grand plantation house, the ground beneath trembled with another kind of preparation. Inside the dark cabin, whispers of defiance turned into a storm of fury. What happened that night would leave 22 white masters dead, their power shattered in an instant, and the memory of it would live on as both terror and triumph. This is not a tale of magic or myth. It is a story of real people, of blood, of unbearable pain, and of courage forged in fire. Stay with us until the end, because what you are about to hear will reveal truths that history books tried to erase. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments from which city are you watching this story. Her name was Sarah, though most of the white masters never bothered to call her that. To them, she was just another body, another pair of hands in the cotton fields of Alabama. But inside the cabins, among her people, Sarah's name carried weight. She was not only known for her strength, but also for her sharp mind and unshakable spirit. Every day, from the first light of dawn until the sun fell behind the fields, Sarah worked tirelessly, her back bent beneath the harsh sun, her hands cut and blistered from endless labor. Yet, even in silence, she commanded respect. Sarah had a gift for healing. With scraps of herbs gathered from the woods, with roots and leaves others overlooked, she knew how to soothe fevers, stop bleeding, and ease pain. Whenever a child grew sick or an elder's strength began to fail, the cabin doors would open, and Sarah would be there, whispering calm words, steadying trembling hands. In the darkness of slavery, she became a source of light, a reminder that not all hope had been stripped away. But Sarah lived with chains no healing hands could remove. She was respected among the enslaved, even feared by some of the masters for her quiet defiance. Yet she was still bound to the same cruel fate as the rest. Every morning she was reminded that no matter how strong, how clever, how essential she became, her life belonged to someone else. That cruel truth lingered like a shadow, pressing against her heart, planting the seed of something deeper, a fire waiting for the right moment to burn. For Sarah, survival meant learning to endure pain in silence, but there was one wound that silence could never heal. It happened in the summer of 1837, 2 years before the Revolt, when her younger brother, Elijah, just 16, was caught resting for a moment in the fields. He had collapsed from exhaustion, the heat of the Alabama sun too much for his frail body. Instead of mercy, the overseer dragged him before the others and lashed him until his cries went hoarse. Sarah could only watch, her body trembling with helpless rage as her brother's skin tore under the whip. When the punishment ended, Elijah never rose again. He was carried back to the cabin, his lifeless body laid on the dirt floor, his face still turned toward the sky he had longed to see freely. That night, Sarah sat beside him, her hands still stained with his blood, and something inside her broke. The grief was unbearable, but beneath it burned another force, a promise that his death would not be forgotten nor forgiven. In the days that followed, she worked as always, silent and composed, but in her heart, Sarah made a vow. She whispered it to herself when no one could hear. One day they will pay for this. The others around her, too afraid to speak, could see it in her eyes. The pain had not only scarred her, it had hardened her resolve. From that moment on, every lash of the whip, every cry of a child, every insult hurled by the masters added weight to the same silent promise. The seed of revolt had been planted, and in Sarah's heart it began to grow. 2 years had passed since Elijah's death, but the scars it left on Sarah's soul never healed. Life on the plantation had only grown harsher. A new overseer had arrived, a man named Jonathan Harker, whose cruelty exceeded anything the enslaved had known before. Where the old overseer punished with lashes, Harker punished with spectacle. He believed fear was the only way to maintain control, and he made sure every act of discipline was carried out in front of all, turning pain into a warning. Workloads doubled. Fields once divided among many now demanded twice the yield with fewer hands. Meals grew smaller, rest shorter, and every act of resistance, no matter how small, was met with ruthless retaliation. Sarah watched as mothers were separated from their children, sold to far-off plantations. She heard the cries of men beaten until they could no longer stand. She saw neighbors vanish overnight, their absence explained only by whispers of punishment too severe to witness. Sarah endured, her face a mask of calm, but inside the anger churned like a storm. Every day, as she bent over the cotton rows, she studied the masters, their routines, their arrogance, their blind faith in their own power. She listened, she remembered, she calculated. The others often looked to her for quiet strength, and though she rarely spoke of vengeance, they could feel it burning within her. By the time the harvest festival of 1839 approached, the tension had become unbearable. The white masters prepared for their grand celebration, stringing lanterns, polishing silver, and setting aside barrels of wine. For them, it was a night of abundance and pride. For Sarah, and for those who still carried fresh wounds of loss and humiliation, it was a reminder of everything stolen from them. With every laugh that echoed from the big house, the fire inside her heart grew hotter. The weight of silence was becoming impossible to bear. The night before the harvest festival, the air was thick with the smell of roasted meat and spilled wine drifting from the big house. The masters celebrated early, laughing loudly as the enslaved worked late into the night to prepare for the grand feast that would come with the dawn. For Sarah, exhaustion was nothing new, but what happened that night pushed her beyond the edge of silence. A young boy named Samuel, barely 12 years old, had been ordered to carry a heavy crate of wine bottles up the steps. His small arms trembled under the weight, and when one bottle slipped and shattered against the wooden porch, the laughter inside the house suddenly stopped. Jonathan Harker, the overseer, stormed out, his face twisted in rage. Without hesitation, he struck Samuel across the face, sending the boy crashing to the ground. But he did not stop there. He forced Samuel to his knees and demanded an apology to the masters, his voice dripping with cruelty. The boy, choking back tears, tried to speak, but Harker raised his whip and lashed him before the crowd of enslaved workers who had gathered, powerless to intervene. Sarah felt her chest tighten, her hands curl into fists as Samuel's cries echoed into the night. It was the same sound she had heard from Elijah years before, the same sound that ended in death. The overseer laughed as if Samuel's suffering was nothing but entertainment, and the masters looked on, indifferent, sipping their wine. When Samuel collapsed, his face bloodied and swollen, Sarah's eyes burned with fury. She knew then that this could not continue. The cruelty had reached its peak, and silence was no longer survival, it was surrender. That night, as she returned to the cabin, the faces around her carried the same grief, the same anger. In the darkness, Sarah's voice finally broke the silence. "No more!" With those two words, the point of no return had been reached. That same night, after Samuel's screams had faded into the silence of the fields, the cabin filled with whispers. The enslaved sat close together, their eyes darting nervously toward the door, afraid that even the walls might betray them. Sarah sat in the center, her voice low but steady, her gaze fierce. She spoke of Elijah, of Samuel, of all the names and faces lost to cruelty, and for the first time, she did not speak of survival, she spoke of vengeance. At first, there was hesitation. Fear clung to them like a second skin, reminding them of chains, whips, and the hangman's rope. But one by one, voices rose. David, whose wife had been sold to another plantation, leaving him broken. Ruth, who carried scars across her back from years of punishment. Old Isaac, who had lost 3 sons to the auction block. Each of them carried a story, each wound becoming another reason to fight. Their grief was no longer silent, it became fuel. Sarah outlined the plan with precision. The harvest festival would be their moment. The masters would be drunk, distracted by music and dancing. The enslaved would be close, serving food and wine, invisible in plain sight. Knives from the kitchen, tools from the barns, even the heavy iron used to bind chains, these would become their weapons. Every detail mattered. Who would strike first? Who would cut the lanterns? Who would block the doors? Before the night ended, Sarah asked them to place their hands together. In the glow of a single candle, they made a vow not just to seek revenge, but to honor the dead and to protect the living. Their voices joined in a whisper that grew stronger with each repetition, "No more, no more." When the candle was blown out, the cabin was plunged into darkness. But inside each heart, the fire burned brighter than ever. The plan was sealed. Tomorrow night, during the festival, the silence of generations would end in blood and fire. The night of the harvest festival arrived with the sound of fiddles and tambourines echoing through the Alabama night. Lanterns swayed from the porch of the big house, casting warm light over the laughter of the masters and their guests. Barrels of wine had been rolled out, and the tables overflowed with roasted meats, fresh bread, and pies. To the masters, it was a night of triumph, a celebration of their wealth and power. To Sarah and her companions, it was the moment they had waited for, the night their silence would break. Dressed in plain linen, Sarah moved among the tables, carrying pitchers of water and baskets of food. No one paid her any mind. She was invisible, as always. But in her eyes there was no submission, only focus. Around her, the others fell into place. David stood near the kitchen door, his hand brushing the handle of a butcher's knife hidden beneath his apron. Ruth served wine with a steady hand, though her lips whispered prayers under her breath. Old Isaac lingered by the stables, where an axe lay concealed beneath a pile of wood. As the night deepened and the masters grew drunk, Sarah gave a single nod. That was the signal. In an instant, the music was cut short by a scream. David struck first, the knife plunging into the overseer Harker's chest as he stumbled with surprise. Ruth smashed a jug of wine over another master's head, the glass shattering in a burst of crimson that looked no different from blood. Chaos erupted. The enslaved, long silenced, unleashed years of rage. Knives, axes, and farming tools swung with precision, each blow aimed at the men who had stolen their lives. The masters fell one by one, their laughter replaced by desperate cries. Sarah herself confronted the plantation owner, a man whose whip had scarred her back years before. She met his eyes as she drove the blade into him, her voice calm as she whispered, "No more." Within moments, the grand festival turned into a massacre. The lanterns that once lit the night with joy now illuminated terror. Guests tried to flee, but the doors had been barred. The enslaved moved like shadows, coordinated and relentless. By the time the moon reached its peak, 22 white masters lay dead. Their reign of cruelty ended in the same soil they had once claimed as their own. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of something new being born, defiance made real. When the last cry of the masters faded into silence, the night air felt strangely still. The enslaved stood frozen for a moment, their chests heaving, their hands stained with blood and sweat. For the first time, the plantation was theirs, if only for a breath of time. Sarah looked around the grand house, once the heart of their suffering, and felt a cold clarity settle over her. It was not enough to kill the men, their world had to burn. With swift hands, they dragged barrels of wine and splashed it across the wooden floors. Torches, taken from the festival lanterns, were raised high. The flames caught quickly, licking up the walls, climbing toward the roof with a roar that echoed across the fields. Within minutes, the house was ablaze, its windows glowing like furious eyes against the dark sky. The place that had witnessed generations of pain was now reduced to fire and ash. The enslaved gathered outside, watching as the structure collapsed, sparks flying into the night. For some, tears rolled freely, not of sorrow, but of release. Old Isaac, who had seen his sons sold away, fell to his knees and pressed his forehead to the earth, whispering their names. Ruth clutched the small cloth doll of her daughter, the only memory she had left, and held it close as the flames rose higher. Sarah stood at the front, her face lit by the fire's glow. She raised her voice so all could hear. "This land is no longer theirs. Tonight we take it back." Her words spread through the crowd, lifting heads, straightening backs. For once, they were not whispering in secret. They were shouting into the night, unafraid. The fire became their final act of purification, a symbol that the master's power had been consumed. The smoke rose high, carrying with it the weight of centuries of silence. For the first time, the cabin and the fields no longer felt like a prison. They felt like the ground of something new, something earned with fire and blood. By dawn, the great house was nothing more than smoldering ruins. The enslaved who survived the night stood in the open fields, their faces lit by the gray light of morning. For the first time, there were no overseers shouting orders, no masters demanding obedience. The air felt strangely light, as if chains had been lifted from their shoulders. Some wept, others embraced, while many simply stared in silence, unable to believe what had just unfolded. Word spread quickly beyond the plantation. By midday, whispers traveled down dirt roads and through nearby farms. The slaves at the Johnson plantation have risen, 22 masters dead. For those still in bondage across Alabama, the story became a spark of hope. If it could happen here, it could happen anywhere. The revolt carried with it the promise that silence did not have to last forever. Among the enslaved, Sarah's name began to be spoken like a prayer, a symbol of courage and defiance. But for the white landowners and authorities, the massacre was a nightmare. Fear rippled through their gatherings. If one plantation could fall, so could others. Within hours, riders were dispatched to spread warnings and militias were raised. The anger of the powerful was swift and merciless. Armed patrols scoured the countryside, searching for survivors of the revolt. To them, Sarah and her people were not heroes. They were fugitives to be hunted down, examples to be punished. That day, freedom felt both real and fleeting. The cabin that had once been their cage was now empty, the fields abandoned. Some wanted to flee into the swamps, others whispered of finding safe passage north. Sarah knew the cost of what they had done would be heavy, but she also knew there was no turning back. They had broken the silence. They had shown that even the strongest chains could snap under the weight of rage and unity. In the immediate aftermath, their victory tasted both sweet and bitter. Sweet, because for one night they had taken back their dignity. Bitter, because the enemy was vast and vengeance would come with fire and blood of its own. The days after the revolt were filled with tension and fear. Sarah and her companions fled into the woods, guided by the moonlight and the whispers of those who promised safe passage. For a brief moment, it seemed as if freedom was within reach, but Alabama's countryside bristled with armed militias, men determined to crush any trace of rebellion. The forests that once offered cover soon became traps. Dogs were unleashed, patrols scoured the swamps, and every settler with a rifle was told to watch for runaways. One night, as the group huddled near a creek, the sound of horses thundered in the distance. Sarah knew the end had come. She told the others to scatter, to take different paths, to survive if they could. She stayed behind, her body steady, her face calm. When the armed riders arrived, torches in hand, Sarah stood tall, refusing to bow. They demanded her surrender. Instead, she spoke clearly, her voice carrying across the night. "We are not property. We are not yours. We will never be silent again." The gunshots that followed silenced her body, but not her spirit. Those who escaped carried her name north, passing it from cabin to cabin, from whispered prayer to hidden song. For the enslaved, Sarah became more than a woman. She became a symbol, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of oppression, courage could rise like fire. The plantation itself was rebuilt by new owners, the ruins of the great house erased as if nothing had ever happened. But among the enslaved, the story endured. They called it the Revolt of the Cabin. Mothers told it to their children, elders recited it in secret gatherings. Every time a whip cracked, every time a family was torn apart, someone would whisper Sarah's name as proof that resistance was possible. Though she did not live to see freedom, her memory lived on as both warning and inspiration. A woman who had lost everything, but gave back the one thing her people had been denied for too long, the belief that they had the right to fight back. The Alabama slave cabin revolt of 1839 was written out of most history books, buried beneath the weight of fear and shame. But the memory survived, carried by voices that refused to let silence win. And even now, nearly 2 centuries later, the echoes of Sarah's defiance remind us that dignity can be stolen but never erased.